Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please?
Please take your seats and fasten your seatbelts.
Flight crew, please prepare for takeoff.
Flight 229, you're clear for departure.
Thank you and enjoy your flight.
Hello, everyone. My name is Graham Mann, and this is the Business Aviation Podcast. On this podcast, we interview business aviation professionals with all sorts of backgrounds to learn about experiences, tips, and best practices to be successful. Today's guest is Sebastien Roy, my co-founder, CEO, and the person behind the original idea for lean systems. I've introduced Sebastien before, but to give a short background, Seb's from Sherbrooke, Quebec in Canada, and did his Ph.D. work focused on superconductivity. He previously worked at Adopt, an operations research company specializing in solving optimization problems like crew scheduling for some of the world's top commercial aviation companies. He graduated from the Founder Institute Montreal with me, which is where we met, and he refined his idea for what would become lean systems and convinced me to join as a co-founder. As one would expect for co-founders, I have an immense amount of respect for Seb. He's one of the smartest, hardworking, and thoughtful people I know. This conversation is Q&A format, and we touch on how we define optimization, how it's used and different in various industries, including commercial and business aviation. And we also talk about data management, best practices, and why it's so important. Make sure to check out the show notes for details and links from the conversation at leansystems.co/podcast. Without further ado, enjoy this chat with my co-founder, Sebastien Roy. Okay, let's start with optimization. So we talk about optimization a lot as what our company does, but what is optimization in general and what's a basic definition?
Yep. So what we think of optimization is really the optimal allocation of resources within a decision-making process. So for example, you have a bunch of employees that needs to work on, say, machines within a factory. And let's say each employee is qualified for more than one machine, but not all of them. Then you have a heavily connected problem where you need to figure out the optimal way to assign these resources based on external constraints. So you will have one criteria over which you want to maximize or minimize something, but you also have a bunch of criteria that has to be met absolutely or ideally.
So what are some industries that are good at implementing this technology or that have been using it for a long time?
Right. So traditionally, companies that have very massive cash flow will have, let's say, financial means to buy traditional optimization schemes and implement them within their organization. And although previously those technologies were so expensive to implement, the amount of savings is equally massive. So it would make sense to spend a year or 2 years or 3 years sometimes to implement an optimization solution to, let's save millions of dollars and more per month.
And so typically are these, like, they're massive cash flow companies. What industries would they operate in?
Yeah, so you can think of the largest train companies, energy companies, the biggest airline carriers, and so on.
So to take a specific example, we're in the field of business aviation right now. Why hasn't optimization technology necessarily been used historically there? And even now, really, it's not common.
Yep. So there's been a lot of data integration that was done in the 90s in commercial aviation that positioned them to implement those technologies well at the time, which is now reaching out to some more companies. So it's been more accessible than ever to create your own fairly advanced cloud-based tech stack where you can start gathering data, monitoring your activities, and running some first-order analysis and analytics on your data. And this is sort of the first step that can lead towards more accessible optimization technologies that are available right now.
So we see some optimization tools being introduced in areas like delivery, local delivery or the Uber example, pickups and drop-offs. And there's some optimization solutions there. What are the typical benefits, but also restrictions of the technology that's used there?
Yep. Okay, so you can think of a triangle where you have like the number of resources you need to manage, the complexity around the regulations or the practices of managing those resources, and then let's say the typical profit margin per resources you can extract within the business. So if one of those corners is too extreme in one direction, it might be cost prohibitive to implement an optimization technology because the margins on your resources are so small that the implementation of optimization or putting in place strong, consistent data tracking is cost prohibitive. But now, if you manage to create a technology that can capture complex rules in a much simpler manner than was previously possible, then you can basically meet some threshold where the typical margin per resource can get increasingly smaller as you go to make optimization affordable and relevant.
Right. So, I mean, in terms of some of the technologies available for routing and so on, it's really because that problem itself, sort of picking up and dropping off things in sequential order, is not towards any of those extremes on the triangle. It's kind of in the middle in terms of simplicity and
so those that we've seen that are implemented are very, very simple in a regulation part, and if the margins are not that significant or that a lot of the costs are externalized, like in on-demand food delivery stuff, Uber is another one, then the quality of optimization required to make the whole thing efficient is not as important.
Right. Okay, so I mean, I think that's a good transition. Let's talk a little bit about what we do here at Lean Systems. So maybe just give the summary with that background of historically companies that were able to afford optimization tech required a lot of cash flow, and now there's some tools for very specific problems like pickups, drop-offs, simplified delivery problems. With that background, maybe just explain what we do.
Yep. So the type of technology that ours is based on has matured a lot in the last years, and the accessibility of open source libraries that are really efficient allow us to reduce our development costs, which is really where the battle is. And so with lower development costs, it's easier to transition from a licensing huge upfront fees model to a subscription-based model where you can basically amortize your costs over a longer period as opposed to have a huge upfront investment. And so the economics of these new technologies with this new business model makes the same level of quality of optimization accessible to more industries.
Right. So it's really taking that advanced optimization tech and pairing it with some new technologies to deploy it in the cloud and make it scalable that sort of brings the cost and barrier to entry down. So with that in mind, where did the idea for Lean System come from?
Yeah, so I used to work for a company that was doing that for commercial aviation. And the opportunity I saw while I was working there was if you can diversify the transportation mode that you're operating within, then you can stagger the planning as a service system as opposed to delivering software on site throughout the month and make it manageable internally. So rather than buy a piece of software that you need to run yourself and end up calling support every time, because this is so complex, there's so many parameters and stuff that you have a hard time using it, then you basically hire someone to use it for you, provide all the specifications of the nature of the planning you want to make, and then just recover those plans and use them effectively. And to make the model work, we had to have customers that do not necessarily operates on a fixed schedule like the commercial aviation does. And so business aviation specifically is a very good opportunity for us because most of them have different operating mode, slightly different. And so we can basically smear over many hours, many times on the day, on the weeks, on the month to optimize their schedules. The other thing is by having newer, more advanced technology, we can have varying planning windows, and then we can we're not as bound to a fixed, like this is 1 month or this is 1 day or this is 2 weeks planning periods, but have varying planning periods that can adapt easy, like in a more consistent manner to how the manual scheduling process is being done. So rather than get there and overhaul the whole operation, have a super traumatic transformation that yields a lot of benefit, but also brings a lot of, let's say, internal challenges, then we can adapt to what manual planners are doing, take control over the planning process, and then eventually optimize the actual planning process to yield better solutions without having a big commotion of changing everything overnight.
Right. So a couple of things. What is the optimization opportunity? What was it or what is it in commercial aviation and sort of the planning period in commercial aviation? And then what are you briefly touched on it, but what are the opportunities in business aviation?
Yeah.
And how is the planning period or the planning process different?
So within the commercial aviation space, there's a very long history of planning rules. Some of them were sort of a negotiated compromise between the regulation entities like the FAA and the feasibility of the planning itself. So the fact that North American companies truncate every calendar month how their schedule are being done was due to the fact that it was just like not humanly possible to plan for longer periods than that. And so there's a very weird legacy state of the, let's say, previous FAR rules that were bound to the human capability of solving the problem. And now this has been progressively removed for FRMS reasons, and which is completely unlike what's being done in Part 135, for example, where this is like, if we don't want to be bound to what scheduled aviation has to do, what's the acceptable compromise for on-demand or chartered or commute style of operations? Yeah, so those historical legacy rules gave rise to what we call bid line, where we would create an anonymized line for pilots and they would bid on those. And then at some point there were a lot of abuse with this system, and so where the golden era of optimization in commercial aviation was when they went from bid line to preferential bidding system that was mostly warranted by courts or by union groups, where they wanted to have better quality of life for the pilots and so on and so forth. But since the operation is so standard or quasi-standard, there's not a lot of there's much lower variation across commercial aviation companies than there is across, say, business aviation companies. And so even though tailoring a solution for one aviation company is much longer than it is today, it was still short enough and close enough to the next guy that they could roll out a solution to most of them. But now, with a more flexible technology, then we can open that within other business mode, other aviation mode. And so given the actual nature of the scheduling rules within the two different rule sets, the potential for optimization is different. The other thing is the business objectives of commercial aviation is slightly different than those from business aviation, where within business aviation, quality of service is much more important than profitability. So all the optimization systems within scheduled aviation is geared toward raw profitability, as opposed to business aviation, where it's more like user experience and convenience and so on and so forth. And so you're not optimizing for the same resources within the same context. So when we go back to the idea of optimal resource allocation, then you're not maximizing or minimizing the same function within these two contexts.
Right. So commercial aviation, historically, I mean, the opportunity has typically been they plan their schedule for the next 6 months or the next quarter, and then it's kind of done. And then you also have the optimization on the crew scheduling side of things. But as you say, it's all profitability geared, whereas business aviation charter tends to be much more mixed objectives, which I think often gets portrayed as something that's not possible with software. So taking into account other measures than profitability, but the reality is not the case. It's just a different optimization function. But also the technology needs to be more flexible.
Exactly.
It's a different problem.
And they're more different. They're more different from one another than they could be within commercial aviation.
Right. Commercial operations tend to be more uniform versus those in business aviation, which all sort of has separate.
Exactly. And now what has changed is that it used to be really hard and complex to adapt to the slightly different variations on a somewhat standard commercial aviation space. But now we can do things that are much more different than before due to new technology available.
Right. So the new technology allows you not only to adapt to different commercial operations much easier, but even go as far as making it easy to adapt between business aviation operations.
I would say like it's as easy to adapt as was before. It's just like so much faster now that it's like economically feasible now to apply that to more areas, more industries than before.
Right. Okay. So I think that's a good transition. Our technology. I mean, we just touched on the fact that new technologies made this level of optimization more available to others in terms of economics, and also that it's more flexible. What makes our technology unique or different from what's been historically available, or what other products are out there?
Okay, so it depends on who you want to compare from, but I think the summarized version is that we have a very experienced team that have seen a lot of optimization contexts. We've known what are the constraints of traditional approaches, and so we know how to find a variation in that theme and make different types of compromise to basically optimize our technology for flexibility rather than raw performance. And so when you start to work in context where you go from manual scheduling to optimized scheduling as opposed to vendor 1 to vendor B within an optimized organization, the impact of moving from manual to optimized is so much larger than from company 1 to company 2, which is like 10% better, means that we don't necessarily have to focus on absolute no compromise best optimal solutions as possible, but rather aim for more flexibility. And at the same time, those super optimal solutions, they end up not being that optimal anyway, because they're so rigid and inflexible that the subtleties of what humans expect from those solutions needs to be revised and fixed. So they will fix ahead or fix after the fact, which degrades the solution to a point that maybe having something a bit less optimal but a bit more flexible will yield a better solution. You can think of the difficulty of capturing the subtleties to be another constraint that is not taking into account in those traditional optimization systems.
Right. I think that highlights a good point. There's a difference between the best theoretical schedule and the best practical schedule, not just from a an optimization point of view, but in terms of how valuable that tool actually is, because a robust solution in reality is much more valuable. And I think the other point that's important there is the team. I mean, there's a difference between theoretical solutions using optimization tools and then actual solutions that work in practice and how to use those tools. So even if you do know the math behind developing those tools, it doesn't necessarily correlate to being able to develop good solutions. So in an optimization context, we talked about some of the example problems where it's been used historically. What are some opportunities or areas that should be using this technology, or that now have the opportunity to use it now that it's more flexible and more economically viable?
Yep. So I think the best way to think of it is thinking of the number of possibilities within the scheduling problem, if we focus on scheduling, or within any resource allocation problem. And so, like, from a mathematical buzzword perspective, let's say NP-hard problems are very good opportunities for optimization. And then, so it just means I have a lot of people, so 30 plus tasks to be done by 3 plus resources. So think of 30 flights to 3 helicopter pilots within a few days, or 1,000 routes within a single day for a fleet of 200 drivers. These are the number of decisions that you have to make is so large that it's really impossible for a human person to go through all of them and find the best one. In practice, they find one good solution. So these are like ideal opportunities where you can do that. Now, aside from that, there's always a complexity of the rules. And with some of our customers, we've been testing that there might not be any limit in complexity. There might not be a limit to complexity of rules set that we can address. We've seen things that are pretty... We have extremes of super simple rule set to extremely complex rule sets. And anything in between should be doable. So you just have to figure out, like, in terms of complexity, what's the actual cost per resource and the actual margin you can extract by optimizing that, and compare that against the rest of your cost structure and figure out if it's relevant or if it's cost effective to optimize. And I mean, from manual to optimize, the impact is so large that it's really hard to justify not buying an optimized solution, because even if it was just like reducing the number of hours spent making those decisions, or like one example was we have a customer who's planning every day. So they used to do the planning manually from like 9 p.m. to 5 a.m. the next day. And now if we start optimizing by, let's say, 10 p.m., we're done at 11. So like the people know their schedules before the day rather than as they wake up, which is a massive difference. So just that advantage is massive.
Yeah, I mean, the full-time equivalent number of hours that you get back is a huge cost savings alone. And I mean, when you talk about rules and regulations, or constraints on the problem and the level of complexity, that's everything from regulatory rules, which in the aviation industry is common, but it also goes all the way down to personal preferences and organizational rules.
Exactly.
So
there's 3 main
it's
categories.
not just regulations.
Yeah. So there's 3 main categories of rules. There's external regulations, things that you need to comply to as an organization. There's internal rules, which typically are contractual rules with the workers. Then you have what referred to as best practices. So typically quality of life, but often would be things that are hard to capture and somewhat intangible, which is like, oh, we will never use aircraft XYZ for this type of flights because some like quirky reason. So those little details are what makes the difference between an effective solution and one that is like pain.
When you have to fix afterwards.
Exactly. And yeah, and now another critical aspect of using an automated solution, even if like regardless of the optimization quality, is the fact that regardless of who's running the scheduling, these rules will be applied consistently the same way systematically to everyone all the time. And this is a very big difference, because it's so hard to capture like judgment calls. Like people can get tired. So as good as they are at scheduling, they had a bad day or something, and then like the schedule is not as good as usual because someone's tired, and then it has a huge impact on operation the next day or the next week. This can be costly, and it's really hard to quantify in terms of costs.
Yeah, and I think the other thing we often see when a solution is implemented with someone who hasn't really sat down and gone through and tried to build this systematic list of rules is, one, they'll discover some that just don't make sense anymore. And like, oh yeah, we've always kind of done it this way, but maybe we don't actually need that. But two, there's often like a conflicting dynamic between whether it's pilots and the scheduling team, or drivers and the scheduling team, or whatever resources in the scheduling team, because not everyone will get the schedule they want, and so on. And if that rule set isn't explicitly defined, then there's no systematic way to make decisions, and it ends up being a conflict within the team.
Yep.
Whereas when you bring in sort of a scheduling tool and a system, and you can look at all the rules and point out, like, here's why we made the decision,
Sure.
and you flew more hours last month, so you get something better this month. It almost externalizes that conflict.
Sure.
So you don't get as much of that battle
Yep.
between the two teams within, and you can just say, well, it's this third party almost, or at least the rule set is transparent.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
even if the conflict is there's a systematic way to resolve conflicts.
Absolutely, and you can quantify it, which is another massive difference. So we've had example where you would have like a pilot complaining about the schedule that person was having the past few weeks, and then looking at the stats, it turns out that this guy's schedule was a better than average. So like you could point out to that person, yeah, I know you noticed on that day you had something way worse than this other guy who had an amazing schedule, but this other guy, like for the rest of the month, had a much crappier schedule than you have. And if you compare yourself to, say, the median or the average on whatever KPI you want to look at, then you could say like, yeah, I understand you're perceiving you're having like bad schedules or whatever, but they're not actually bad, your schedules. So maybe your expectations are wrong. And then as an organization, you can better manage expectations from your workforce and better clarify, or rather communicate what's the gap, let's say, between the perceived and actual. And it's not necessarily because there's bad actors in there. It's just like it's human nature, like cherry picking the things that are bad but neglecting the things that were awesome.
Right.
Or some form of confirmation bias. And there's other subtleties that relates to how you want to optimize and manage your operations. But we know that the more resources you aggregate together over the longest periods you can, the better the outcome is, or the yield is, which means that from a statistical perspective, as an individual, you might have 4 crappy days in a row, but you need to have once in a while those 4 crappy days in a row so that over the full year, you have a much better average than trying to not have more than, say, 1 crappy day in a row.
Right. So the ability to look farther sometimes helps in terms of building those even
But as an
schedules as well.
organization, you can make the decision saying, yeah, we understand that forbidding more than 2 consecutive crappy days based on whatever criteria is too expensive for us. Like it would cost, I don't know how many $1,000 a month to satisfy this criteria. And as an organization, we think that this loss of money against the quality of life is not important enough. And then you can quantify those decisions. And typically, I think most people like what they do, and they're honest people. And so they can accept that, yeah, I love my job enough to understand that what I would like ideally is infeasible, and this is a compromise I'm willing to make. And having quantified means to communicate that removes a whole bunch of like resentment and
Yeah, it's hard to quantify, but
kicking the can down the lines kind of stuff.
yeah, it is difficult to quantify, but in terms of team dynamic, it does make a big difference once you manage to implement that. So for business aviation specifically, we talked a bit about how it was different than commercial, but within business aviation, let's talk about specific use cases. What are the areas that really there's an opportunity to use optimization technology?
So I think the two main ones is in terms of quality of life for scheduling on the pilot parts, and the other one would be around routing. It really depends on how you're operating. So if you have two extreme example, one where we have a unified fleets and let's say it's commute type of flights, so it's somewhat scheduled. There's no surprise in terms of which aircraft will fly from where to where, but you just have to figure out who's going to fly and when. Then this is one very good example. The other extreme would be the complete other way around, where you have like multiple aircraft types and not necessarily strong bindings between what the customers will request in terms of aircraft. So let's say they can pick a type, light, medium, heavy, and they pick a date and an airport origin destination, and then you can organize the routing to minimize the heading. And we've ran some numbers, and sure, it's fun it's great to recover empty legs by selling seats on the cheap, because it's kind of free money because you typically charge for those deadheads. Mm-hmm. But not flying those in the first place is way more cost effective.
Right. And then the third use case we sometimes see is scheduling maintenance too.
Yeah, so maintenance is special because in Part 135, the regulations aren't as severe as within commercial aviation, and it depends on regions a bit and so on. But if you're really focused on safety and you want to run your maintenance on a tight ship and so on, there's no way to predict when you should send your aircraft to maintenance unless you predict what they will be flying. And so you kind of have this chicken and egg problem where you need to figure out how many flights do I assign to this aircraft so I can bring it to maintenance on that day, or rather on which day should I bring it to maintenance based on the expected flying sequence I'm going to have. And so we're working with, in one case where the regulations is pretty severe. You need to have regular checks at regular intervals in terms of flying hours and cycles and so on. And the number of available aircraft is fairly limited, and the flying volume is really high. So you have to be smart about this. So you can generate, if you continuously reschedule your flights on aircraft and reschedule maintenance over a certain window of time, then you can put in criteria in the optimization system saying, we only want to run maintenance on weekends. We only want to run one maintenance per weekends. We want to make aircraft available for a certain capacity per day and so on. Then you can run that scheduling, and even though you won't be able to fix the schedule until the week before, roughly, at least you can always answer the question, can I send my aircraft to maintenance so that I can maximize my flying capacity without burdening my maintenance teams, regardless of what's the actual schedule.
Right. Yeah, and I think so. Sort of the three use cases there: crew scheduling, leg selection, I guess we'll call it, or fleet optimization, and maintenance scheduling. And I think the other thing too is whether it's for maintenance or routing or whatever, it becomes much easier to start simulating events like what happens if we add an aircraft to the fleet of this type based on historical or projected data. How does that look? What happens if we add this many crew? How can we change our schedules around? So, I mean, there's another opportunity in all of those cases, basically to begin to be able to plan better.
Sure. Once you take control of your planning process, then you can start asking yourself these questions. And we've had cases where we've been thinking of hire 20 more people. And we're like, let's look at it. And it turns out that they did not need those 20 people. So like just increase the capacity and we'll just like do this and that sort of adjustment to your planning system.
Right.
And then we'll plan based on that. And then, but be careful, like these guys will be working more. So
right.
In their cases, they're paid by the amount of the number of tasks they're making. So it suits them. Like that's fine. Everyone, it's a win-win situation for them, which might not always be the case, but you can at least establish thresholds of productivity per resource, like per pilot or per aircraft, and use that as a decision-making trigger to say, oh, we need to hire this many people.
Yeah. And I mean, we've seen situations too where, you know, we've got a certain number of crew right now, but we want to up the number of days off they get per month to 8. So yeah, you can add a number of crew, but it's very difficult sometimes if you have a bunch of different aircraft, for example, or a bunch of different methods of operating to know who to hire, what qualifications they need, how many extra you need to add to actually give that to the rest of your crew. And all that becomes possible when you systemize the planning.
So there's a very counterintuitive thing that happens there, which is like when you're used to run your scheduling manually, you kind of have rough estimates in terms of capacity per resource, like capacity per pilot, capacity per aircraft. And when the company is growing fast, you can think of it as a linear progression where you're just like, I need twice as many crews, so you hire like another extra fleet of people, and then I need the 10% more aircraft, and then you bring those in. But what happens is that the combination of decision-making challenges is so large that your actual capacity per resource goes down.
Right.
So you kind of need to hire way more than you expected, and which worsens the problem. Whereas if you're optimizing everything already, the opposite happens. Like the more resources you have, the more productivity per resource you can yield with an optimization system.
Right. The relationship isn't necessarily linear, nor is it the same relationship for everyone.
Yeah, it depends on a lot of criteria.
Exactly.
But as a rule of thumb, if you're doing things manually, adding more people to the problem will make it worse per people.
Right.
Whereas if you're optimizing, it will make it better per people.
Right. One of the early issues we see with customers is data management. So there's a variety of issues that we see, but oftentimes it's just difficult to get the data that is required.
Yeah.
So it's a long question, but I guess maybe let's talk about some of the issues we see first, and then maybe some of the best practices that people can try and improve now before they actually go seeking some new tools or technology.
Yeah, so a few extreme examples are, so the easiest one would be no data tracking at all, because you're starting from nothing and you can build from the ground up the right thing, trademark. Because if we're involved in the setting up a new data management system, regardless of if we implement the data management system or not, we can at least direct or make recommendations on what should be tracked and how. Mm-hmm. The other extreme we see is that we've been gathering data since forever, but then like the data gathering is not necessarily what's needed. There's like a bunch of things that needs to be reworked, and they're often tracked in legacy systems that are hard to connect with other external systems and so on. And so this is not necessarily ideal. And the other extreme example we've had is when the data you need to have access to has many external players involved in the whole thing where integration may or may not be entirely possible. And so the worst case we've seen is manually re-entering data from one system to another, which can lead to a whole bunch of problems, or having some sort of obscure mechanism to transfer data from one system to the next. And if you're not careful internally to train everyone who needs to interact with those systems in terms of how they're integrated together and who's responsible for what, then it can be messy. Now, in practice, if we go back to the example of those who have been tracking data for a while but not tracking it the right way, let's say, the main thing is that you need to be making a distinction between planning data and operational data. And most people will aggregate the two together. So the worst case we've seen is like salespeople are playing in the same database as the planning people. And so the system will not always be 100% aligned with the features that are required for each of those teams to be effective at their work. So they will all use sort of workarounds around the system. And those workarounds are hard to program or to extract and can be confusing or lead to inconsistent data. So one example would be a client is booking a flight and a return flight. So from the invoicing perspective, you want to book a trip that is a round trip, but the first leg might be a Monday and the returning trip might be a week later. And so it shows up in the database as one trip that starts, say, on a Monday and then the next Monday. But you won't be like landing the aircraft on destination and leave it there for a week. You'll fly it back through a dead end. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes you might like copy these two trips and create some sort of fake sales ID numbers. And then the planning team knows that these are the copies of the other trips. There's no data-driven link between the two. And then we get that and things go wrong, obviously. So having a mechanism to either tag appropriately data from the sales front, the operational front, and the planning front, or having 3 different but connected systems is usually the way to go. And so when we see people who implement their own things in-house, they don't necessarily have the perspective or the step back to look at that from how this will go in the future with future systems and future technologies, and what traps and pitfalls can be avoided up front, which is not easy at all. And the other constraint is that when this is built by an internal IT person or team, which is typically a person, these people will be overworked. And so there's some missing features, not because we don't know we need them, but because there's just no time to build those features.
Right. So I think another good example about the planned schedule versus operating schedule is, you know, we've gone into companies and taken some historical data to do some analysis, and a constraint upon that analysis is, you know, a 60-minute minimum turnaround time, but the actual operated schedule, because something got delayed, the real turnaround time was 5 minutes, and then it becomes very hard to compare the two schedules because the constraints are different, basically, even though that schedule was probably planned with 60-minute intervals. That data isn't stored, so you never see that. So, and then I mean, other issues, you know, even if you store data, if it's incorrect and that data gets passed to other tools, then those issues propagate down the line, so to speak. So in an ideal scenario, what is the ideal scenario? I mean, you're tracking sort of the major iterations that your schedule goes through in time and pushing those, basically storing those elsewhere. You're making sure the data is clean and it's in some sort of format, whether it's CSV or some other flexible format that doesn't require external software. Is that the ideal situation?
Yeah. So depending on so the thing you have to think about there's two things to think about. One is the timeline itself. So the timeline is what's the planning, how much time we spend planning, when after the planning time will that plan be operated, and what's the operation window as well, and what's the delta between the end of planning and start of operation. So that's one aspect against the rate of changes in the operation system. So if the rate of change in the operation system is fairly low compared to the planning time and small compared to the operation window, what you can do is have a live system and then have a planning system and run snapshots of your live system and then run planning on that. And when you push the plan to the operation system, the number of conflicts should be small, if any, and then you can just modify the new planning that was pushed inside the operation system as being the operational data. Now, if you're in the opposite direction where changes are super frequent or the replanning windows is small or the time between plan and operated is small, then you need to be much smarter about this. So you could have, like, the ideal solution would be an operational system that can resolve conflicts and track versioning of plans. So it looks at, so one example, let's say next Wednesday at 4, there's a flight scheduled. So now today, Friday at 6, the Wednesday 4 o'clock flight is planned to be at 4 o'clock by this aircraft and this person. But if tomorrow, Saturday at noon, this flight gets pushed to let's say 7, then when you're operating, you might not know that at some point that flight was scheduled to be at 4 rather than 7, and this is why the previous flight ends like so much earlier.
Right.
So you have new optimization opportunities that may occur, that may appear, or others that disappear based on those changes because it has a massive rippling effect.
Right.
And so the two extremes is super stable versus unstable, put it that way. And depending on which of those extremes you are and the time it takes to run the planning, this will tell you if you should go with 2 separate systems or a single super smart system. Now, the other thing to think about that is unrelated to this time aspect, whenever there's some information that is floating inside people's head, you're missing information in your data system. Whenever you have a capture set of data and information that requires context, so if any random person was to look at the data and not be able to understand 100% what it means, you're missing data as well. So, and related to that is like missing data is unfindable.
Right.
So like if you're like, oh, I'd like the program that detects that I've forgotten to export 5 flights out of the 100, like there's no way we can do that, because how can the external system know if there was supposed to be 100 flights but we received 95, whereas there was 95 flights. So those validation checkpoints can either be part of the integration system, the integrated system, or as part of the planning process itself, as a checklist saying, oh, I've exported 95 flights. Is there 95 at the other end? Oh, there's 90. There's 5 missing. Where are they? And so on and so forth. So you cannot automate things that cannot be read from a file that you can pass to a new employee that just got its training and have him understand, as opposed to, oh, I'm understanding this because I was there yesterday to operate the whole thing. That's why I know that if there's missing something there.
Right. So in terms of current operations, the minimum ideal, I guess, is time-stamped schedules.
Yep.
Including both what was planned and then what was eventually operated.
Yep.
And then the next, in some sort of standardized central format that that you make sure captures all this information, including stuff that is not usually written down. And then sort of the next step for that is putting context to the changes. So adding some notes or
exactly.
things about why this flight changed or here this changed from this planning period to this
because
one.
then you can run analysis. And I don't know who I was giving this example recently. Like when problem XYZ happen, we systematically make this decision. And then if you're not tracking all these things, it might be a systematically wrong decision you're making all the time, and you're just doing it because, and then you can figure out that, oh, it makes no sense to make that decision because we can look at the evolution of the plans we made, and it turns out that this decision systematically gets overruled during the operation day. Like the dispatchers will systematically undo that decision, so it makes no sense to make it. And vice versa. Like we never make that decision. This is always what happens. An example could be in a context where you're somewhere between on-demand and plan, like we have with some ground transport customers. You would have routes would systematically be canceled, and like the drivers might know it will be canceled. So once they see that in their schedule, they're like, nope, I'm not doing that. And so it makes no sense to plan for that route because it's going to change so much that they always get redispatched on the day of. So if you're planning for it, you're losing way more time than just leaving it uncovered. Right. If it's uncovered, the dispatch team goes in at the start of their shift. They're like, oh, this thing's uncovered. I need to find someone to cover that thing. And then they look in their reserve or contingency drivers and whatever, assigned it there, and you're done. Whereas if it was assigned to someone, then you need to confirm that the person will do the actual task. The person last minute says, I'm not doing it. And then it goes back in operate time, and then rather than have, say, an hour to solve that problem, you have 5 minutes. Right. So those decisions are like much poorer. Right. And to be able to flag those type of issues, you really need to track that history of changes from plan 1, plan 2, plan 3 to operation, and look back after the fact to analyze that and extract those insights.
Yeah, and I mean, the other thing I think that's worth illustrating is we're talking about this from the perspective of sometime in the future you're going to have a third party come in to try and implement some technology, and they need to be able to grasp as much as they can about how things work from that data. Yep. But the other thing is, internally, if you're not tracking that data, you become vulnerable to the people that have all this information in their heads. If they leave and you're forced to train someone else, or someone else doesn't have that data, then it all gets lost in the process. Yep. And we've seen that with customers where, you know, their head scheduler, or the magician, as we sometimes call them, leaves, and they're kind of screwed because a lot of information gets lost, and that's a big stress on the organization.
Yeah, it turns out that we often have more information about that than our customers.
Right, and that's simply because we're forced to analyze that and dig into the data, and you know, a lot of people don't do that internally, but it's important.
Yep.
Hello everyone, thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Just a reminder, you can find show notes, links to everything we talked about, and more at leansystems.co/podcast. And I would encourage you to sign up for our email list to make sure you get notified about new blog posts and podcasts. See you next time.